The conference room fell silent when my boss Bradley Morrison cleared his throat. 23 employees sat around the table, including me, all of us summoned to what we'd been told was an important company-wide announcement. I'd suspected for weeks something was coming. The hushed executive meetings, the visiting consultants, the subtle tension that had been building like a storm approaching shore. "Thank you all for gathering on short notice," Bradley began, his voice carrying that careful tone executives use when delivering bad news they want to sound compassionate about. "As you know, the market has been challenging this year. After extensive analysis, the board has made some difficult decisions about our company's future structure." I watched faces around the table shifting from curiosity to anxiety. My colleague Teresa reached for her water glass with a trembling hand. Marcus from accounting had gone pale. Everyone sensed what was coming, but no one wanted to hear it confirmed. "We'll be implementing significant workforce reductions," Bradley continued. "Approximately 40% of our staff will be laid off effective 2 weeks from today. Human Resources will be meeting with affected individuals over the next 2 days to discuss severance packages and transition support." The room erupted in gasps and muted exclamations. Teresa started crying. Marcus looked like he might be sick. Several people began whispering urgently to neighbors, trying to calculate their own odds of survival. I sat perfectly still, my face carefully neutral, while my mind raced through calculations. 40% reduction meant roughly 30 people losing jobs from our 70-person company. 2 weeks notice meant they'd announced early enough to seem considerate, while actually giving themselves time to prevent mass exodus of remaining staff before the cuts were finalized. "I know this is difficult news," Bradley said, raising his voice slightly to quiet the murmuring, "but I want to assure everyone that these decisions were made carefully, based on business needs rather than personal factors. Those affected will receive fair severance packages, continued health insurance for 3 months, and letters of recommendation. We're also offering career counseling services to help with your transition." Fair severance packages. That phrase caught my attention. I'd been with the company for 7 years, had built their entire data analytics infrastructure, and held institutional knowledge about systems and clients that would be extremely difficult to replace. If I was being laid off, and my instincts said I probably was, given recent friction with Bradley over strategic direction, I wanted to know exactly what fair severance meant before I showed any emotional reaction. "Individual meetings will begin tomorrow morning," Bradley concluded. "Please check your email for scheduling. And I want to emphasize that we value every person here, and this decision in no way reflects on your individual contributions or worth." The meeting ended with people standing uncertainly, some heading directly to the bathroom to cry, others clustering in groups for whispered speculation about who might be on the list. I returned to my desk and immediately opened my employment contract, my offer letter, and the employee handbook. I'd reviewed these documents when I was hired, but hadn't looked at them in years. Now I needed to understand exactly what I was entitled to if my employment was terminated. The handbook stated severance would be calculated as 2 weeks' pay for every year of service, with a cap of 12 weeks. That meant I'd receive 14 weeks of severance, approximately $30,000 based on my current salary. Health insurance would continue for 3 months at the company's expense, then I could transition to COBRA. Accrued vacation time would be paid out in my final check. I also reviewed my non-compete agreement, which prohibited me from working for direct competitors or soliciting company clients for 1 year after employment ended. However, the agreement specified that the non-compete was only enforceable if I received severance payment. If the company chose to terminate me without severance, the non-compete became void. This was an important detail I filed away for potential future use. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze of speculation and anxiety from my colleagues. Several people stopped by my desk asking if I thought I was safe, if I'd heard anything, if I knew who might be on the list. I deflected with neutral responses while continuing my research into employment law, severance negotiations, and my options if I was indeed laid off. The email arrived at 4:47 p.m. Subject line, Meeting tomorrow, HR. My meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. the following morning with Helena Vance from Human Resources and Bradley. The timing, first thing in the morning, suggested I was being laid off. They typically delivered the worst news early, getting difficult conversations out of the way before facing a day of remaining employees who'd survived the cuts. I spent that evening not crying or panicking, but instead preparing. I created a detailed summary of every project I'd led, every system I'd built, every process improvement I'd implemented. I documented my contributions to the company's bottom line, cost savings from efficiency improvements, revenue generated from analytics projects that had informed successful business decisions. I calculated that my work over 7 years had generated approximately $1.2 million in measurable value to the company, a conservative estimate that didn't include intangible contributions like training staff, mentoring junior employees, and building institutional knowledge that would be expensive to replace. I also researched market rates for someone with my skills and experience. Data analytics managers in our industry typically earned between $90,000 and $120,000. I was currently making $85,000, which meant I'd been underpaid by $10,000 to $35,000 annually for years, a fact I'd accepted because I'd enjoyed the work and valued job security. But if that security was ending, the underpayment became relevant negotiating leverage. At 8:55 a.m., I walked into the conference room where Helena and Bradley waited. Helena offered me a sympathetic smile. Bradley couldn't quite meet my eyes, which confirmed what I'd already suspected. "Thank you for meeting with us, Chloe," Helena began. "I'm afraid we have difficult news. Your position is being eliminated as part of the restructuring we announced yesterday." I nodded calmly, showing no emotion. "I understand. Can you walk me through the specifics of my severance package?" Helena slid a folder across the table. "You'll receive 14 weeks of severance pay, as calculated by our policy of 2 weeks per year of service. Health insurance will continue at company expense for 3 months. Your accrued vacation time, 43 hours, will be paid in your final check. Your last day will be 2 weeks from today, though we're prepared to negotiate an earlier departure if you prefer." "What about my non-compete agreement?" I asked. Bradley shifted uncomfortably. "That remains in effect. You're prohibited from working for direct competitors or soliciting company clients for 1 year following your departure. My contract specifies that non-compete provisions are only enforceable if severance is paid," I replied. "If I decline the severance package, the non-compete becomes void. Is that correct?" Helena consulted her notes, clearly not having anticipated this question. "That's technically correct, yes. But I'm not sure why you'd decline severance to void a non-compete. The severance provides valuable financial support during your transition." "I'm not suggesting I'll decline," I said. "I'm clarifying the terms, so I fully understand my options. Now, I'd like to discuss negotiating a more substantial severance package." Bradley's eyes widened. Clearly, he'd expected tears, pleading, or passive acceptance. Negotiation had not been on his anticipated script for this conversation. "The standard severance calculation is already quite generous," Bradley began. "It's based on a clear formula applied consistently across all affected employees. We're not in a position to offer individualized increases." "Let me explain why an increased severance would be appropriate in my case," I replied, pulling out the documentation I'd prepared. "Over 7 years, I've built your entire data analytics infrastructure, systems that the company relies on daily for reporting, forecasting, and strategic decision-making. I'm the only person who fully understands how these systems work, their limitations, and how to troubleshoot problems when they arise." I slid my summary across the table. "I've documented measurable value I've generated, $1.2 million in cost savings and revenue improvements. That's a conservative calculation that doesn't include intangible value from training staff, building institutional knowledge, or preventing expensive mistakes through analysis that informed better decisions." "Those contributions are why you've been employed here," Bradley countered. "You were compensated through your salary for that work. Severance is separate from past performance. It's about transition support as we end our employment relationship. Severance is also about protecting the company's interests after my departure," I replied. You're concerned about me working for competitors or soliciting clients, which is why you have non-compete provisions. But those provisions only work if I accept severance. If I decline severance to void the non-compete, I could immediately join a competitor and potentially take clients who've worked with me for years. Helena and Bradley exchanged glances. Clearly, they hadn't considered that the non-compete provisions could be turned into negotiating leverage. Are you threatening to decline severance and violate the spirit of your non-compete agreement? Bradley asked, his voice taking on an edge. I'm clarifying that I have options, I replied calmly. You're offering me 14 weeks of severance, approximately $30,000, to accept restrictions on my employment opportunities for a full year. That's not a particularly attractive offer when I consider that declining severance would allow me to immediately pursue opportunities with competitors who'd value my skills and knowledge. I leaned forward slightly. However, if you were to offer a more substantial severance package, let's say 6 months instead of 14 weeks, I'd be much more motivated to accept the non-compete restrictions and to spend 2 weeks doing comprehensive documentation of systems and processes to ensure smooth transition for whoever inherits my responsibilities. Helena was making notes. Bradley's face had gone red, frustration replacing his earlier sympathy. You're holding the company hostage, Bradley accused. You're threatening to abandon your professional responsibilities and immediately work for competitors unless we pay you significantly more than other employees receive. I'm negotiating fair compensation for the value I provide and the restrictions you're asking me to accept, I corrected. Other employees may find 14 weeks adequate because they don't face the same employment restrictions, or because their knowledge is less specialized. My situation is unique, which justifies different terms. We need to discuss this internally, Helena said, clearly recognizing that the conversation had moved beyond the standard layoff script. Can you give us until end of day to review your proposal? Of course, I replied, standing. But I should mention that I'll need final severance terms in writing before I commit to any transition documentation. I won't begin that work based on verbal promises. I left them sitting at the conference table, Bradley looking furious and Helena looking thoughtful. The meeting had gone exactly as I'd planned. I'd introduced uncertainty about their assumptions, created leverage through the non-compete provision, and positioned myself as someone willing to negotiate rather than passively accept whatever terms they offered. Word spread quickly that I'd been laid off. Several colleagues stopped by my desk to offer condolences, which I accepted gracefully while revealing nothing about the negotiation happening behind the scenes. By 4:30 p.m., I received an email requesting a follow-up meeting at 5 p.m. When I returned to the conference room, Helena was alone. Bradley had another commitment, she explained, which I interpreted as him being too angry to face me directly. I've spoken with our legal counsel and with the executive team about your proposal. We're prepared to offer you 20 weeks of severance instead of 14, which represents approximately $40,000. I proposed 6 months, I reminded her. 20 weeks is approximately 5 months. That's correct. We're meeting you in the middle between our standard package and your request. Helena slid a revised offer letter across the table. In exchange for accepting these terms, we expect you to spend your remaining 2 weeks creating comprehensive documentation of all systems, processes, and institutional knowledge necessary for transition. I reviewed the offer carefully. 20 weeks at my current salary of $85,000 would yield approximately $32,000, not $40,000 as Helena had stated. She'd either miscalculated or was hoping I wouldn't notice the discrepancy. The math doesn't work, I said. 20 weeks at my current salary is $32,000, not $40,000. Helena checked her notes, then flushed slightly. You're right, I apologize for the error. The amount would be approximately $32,000. So, you're offering me an additional 6 weeks beyond the standard package, I said. That's a $10,000 increase from your original offer. I appreciate the movement, but it's still significantly less than the 6 months I proposed. I pushed the offer back across the table. Let me outline what you're actually asking for. You want 2 weeks of intensive documentation work, capturing 7 years of knowledge about complex systems. You want me to train whoever is inheriting my responsibilities, ensuring they can maintain systems I built. And you want me to accept a 1-year non-compete that restricts my employment opportunities with competitors who'd immediately value my expertise. In exchange, you're offering me an additional $10,000 beyond standard severance. That works out to approximately $5,000 per week for the intensive documentation work and $5,000 for a year-long employment restriction that could cost me significantly more in lost opportunities. I lean back. That's not a compelling offer. I think we should stick with my proposal of 6 months severance. That would be approximately $48,000 total, an $18,000 increase from your 20-week offer. In exchange, you get comprehensive documentation, smooth transition, and confidence that I won't immediately join a competitor and take clients. Helena was quiet for a moment, clearly calculating whether she had authority to agree or needed to escalate further. I need to discuss with Bradley and potentially with our CEO. This is significantly above what we've offered any other affected employee. I understand that, I replied, but I'm also the only affected employee who built critical systems that the company relies on daily. My situation is unique, which justifies unique terms. Let me be clear about something, Helena said, her tone shifting to more formal. If you decline our severance offer and choose to void your non-compete, we'll view any immediate employment with competitors as violating the spirit of your professional obligations. We'll also decline to provide any references for future employment. Those are consequences I'd consider carefully, I agreed, but they don't change the calculation. If I decline severance, I save you $32,000 while freeing myself to immediately pursue opportunities that could pay significantly more than the 12 months of restricted employment you're asking me to accept. Helena stood. I'll discuss your proposal with leadership first thing tomorrow morning. We'll have a response by noon. That evening, I didn't anxiously wait for their response. Instead, I contacted several competitors and clients I'd worked with over the years, casually mentioning I might be exploring new opportunities. The responses were enthusiastic. 3 companies immediately expressed interest in hiring me. One client mentioned they'd been looking for someone to help build analytics systems similar to what I'd developed. The market was strong for my skills, and multiple parties were eager to discuss opportunities. The next morning at 10:30 a.m., 90 minutes before their promised noon response, Helena called requesting an immediate meeting. When I arrived at the conference room, both Helena and Bradley were present, along with Timothy Walsh, the company's CEO, who I'd met only a handful of times during my 7 years. Chloe, thank you for meeting with us, Timothy began. Helena and Bradley have brought me up to speed on your negotiations regarding severance terms. I want to personally address your concerns and hopefully reach an agreement that works for everyone. The CEO's presence signaled I'd created genuine uncertainty for them. They were taking my negotiations seriously, which meant my leverage was working. I appreciate you making time to discuss this, I replied. Timothy leaned forward, adopting a pose of earnest reasonableness. Here's our situation. We're making difficult cuts across the organization. If we give you 6 months severance significantly above our standard calculation, other employees will hear about it. They'll feel the process was unfair, that some people were treated preferentially. That creates morale issues and potential legal exposure if people claim we were arbitrary or discriminatory in how we calculated severance. I understand that concern, I said. But my situation is genuinely unique. I'm not asking for preferential treatment. I'm asking for fair compensation, given the specialized knowledge I possess and the employment restrictions you're asking me to accept. Timothy nodded. I recognize your contributions and the value you've provided. What if we structured this differently? We offer you our standard 14-week severance, but we also offer you a consulting contract for 3 months at your current hourly rate. During that period, you'd be available to answer questions, help with transition issues, and provide limited support as needed. I did the mental math quickly. 3 months of consulting at roughly 40 hours per month would be approximately 120 hours. At my current salary converted to hourly rate, about $40 per hour, that would be $4,800. Combined with the 14-week standard severance of approximately $30,000, the total would be roughly $35,000. That's an interesting proposal, I said, but I have some concerns. First, 3 months of consulting at 40 hours per month assumes I'd only work about 10 hours per week. Given the complexity of the systems and the learning curve for whoever inherits them, I think it's more realistic to anticipate 20 to 30 hours per week for the first month, then decreasing over time. Second, my current salary converts to about $40 per hour. But my market rate as an independent consultant for specialized data analytics work would be closer to $150 per hour. If you're asking me to consult rather than simply walking away after my last day, you should compensate at market rates rather than my employed hourly rate. Third, a 3-month consulting contract doesn't address the non-compete provision. I'd still be restricted from pursuing other opportunities during and after the consulting period. I pulled out my notes. Here's a counter-proposal. Give me the standard 14-week severance. Offer me a 3-month consulting contract at $100 per hour. A compromise between my employed rate and market rate, with an anticipated 20 hours per week for the first month, 15 hours for the second month, and 10 hours for the third month. That's approximately 45 hours total, or $4,500. Finally, modify my non-compete to only restrict me from soliciting current clients during the consulting period. After the consulting contract ends, the non-compete expires, allowing me to pursue opportunities with competitors. Timothy, Bradley, and Helena conferred in whispers while I waited. Finally, Timothy spoke. We're prepared to agree to most of your proposal. 14 weeks standard severance, 3-month consulting contract at $100 per hour with the anticipated hours you outlined. But we can't completely eliminate the non-compete. Instead, we'll reduce it to 6 months after the consulting contract ends, and it will only prohibit directly soliciting current clients. You're free to work for competitors as long as you're not actively trying to take our business. I considered this carefully. It was significantly better than their original offer. Total compensation of approximately $39,500 instead of $30,000. Plus, I'd only be restricted from soliciting clients for 6 months instead of a year, and I could work for competitors immediately, as long as I wasn't targeting the current client base. I have one additional term, I said. I want a written letter of recommendation from Bradley acknowledging my contributions and the value I provided during my 7 years here. And I want the ability to reference Bradley as a professional contact for future opportunities. Bradley looked uncomfortable, but Timothy nodded. That's reasonable. Bradley will provide a strong letter of recommendation. Then we have a deal, I said. Timothy smiled with visible relief. Excellent. Helena will get the revised offer letter to you by end of day. Thank you for working with us constructively on this. After they left, I sat alone in the conference room for a moment, processing what I'd just accomplished. Through calm negotiation, rather than emotional reaction, I'd increased my severance package by approximately $9,500, plus secured beneficial modifications to my non-compete restrictions. More importantly, I'd maintained my professional reputation while ensuring I'd be compensated fairly for the value I'd provided and the transition support they were requesting. Word spread quickly that I'd negotiated for terms than the standard severance package. Several colleagues approached asking how I'd done it, what I'd said, whether they could negotiate too. I was carefully vague about specifics while offering general advice. Understand your employment contract and company policies. Document your unique value. Be prepared to walk away from a bad offer, and negotiate based on rational self-interest rather than emotion or loyalty to a company that was eliminating your position. One colleague, Marshall, took my advice to heart. He was a senior software developer whose skills were similarly specialized and hard to replace. He requested a meeting with HR and attempted to negotiate improved terms. However, Marshall's approach was more aggressive than strategic. He made demands without offering value in return, threatened to leave immediately without transition support, and generally created antagonism rather than seeking mutually beneficial outcomes. His negotiation failed, and the company held firm to their standard offer. Marshall left angry and bitter, bad-mouthing the company to anyone who'd listen. "You got extra severance and I got nothing," Marshall complained to me on his final day. "It's not fair. We both had specialized skills, and the company needs both of us." "The difference is how we approach the negotiation," I replied. "I positioned it as solving problems for the company, providing transition documentation and consulting support in exchange for improved terms. You positioned it as the company owing you without offering anything in return except threats of difficult departure." Marshall didn't want to hear it. He left convinced he'd been treated unfairly, unable to recognize that negotiation requires offering value rather than just demanding it. My last 2 weeks at the company were remarkably productive. I created detailed documentation of every system I'd built, wrote training manuals for common processes, and recorded video walkthroughs of complex procedures. I trained my replacement, a junior analyst named Priya who'd been promoted into my role, with patience and thoroughness, ensuring she understood not just the mechanics of the systems but the underlying logic and architecture. Colleagues who'd been anxious about their own employment situations seemed almost envious of my transition. I was leaving with substantial severance, a consulting contract ensuring continued income, and the freedom to pursue new opportunities with competitors. Meanwhile, those who'd survived the layoffs faced increased workloads, anxiety about future cuts, and the stress of maintaining their positions in an organization that had just eliminated 40% of staff. "I wish I'd been laid off," my colleague Felix admitted during lunch on my second-to-last day. "You're getting paid to leave, you have that consulting contract for income security, and you're free to find something better. Meanwhile, I'm stuck here doing the work of 2 people, with no guarantee they won't do another round of cuts next year." It was a perspective I hadn't fully considered, that getting laid off with good severance and negotiated terms was potentially better than remaining in an unstable environment with increased demands. On my final day, Bradley called me into his office for an exit interview. He handed me the letter of recommendation he'd written, which was professionally worded and highlighted my contributions without being effusive. "I'll admit I was angry when you negotiated your severance," Bradley said. "It felt like you were taking advantage of a difficult situation, holding the company hostage when we were already struggling with tough decisions." "I understand that perspective," I replied. "But from my view, I was simply ensuring fair compensation for the value I provided and the restrictions you were asking me to accept." Bradley nodded slowly. "In retrospect, I think you were right to negotiate. The consulting contract has already proven valuable. Priya has questions almost daily, and having you available to answer them has prevented significant problems. If you'd just left angry, we'd be struggling much more than we are." He paused before continuing. "I also learned something about how we should handle future layoffs. We should be more thoughtful about unique situations, more willing to negotiate with key employees rather than applying one-size-fits-all policies. Your negotiation was uncomfortable for me, but ultimately, it resulted in better outcomes for everyone." "I appreciate you saying that," I said. We shook hands, and I left the office for the last time, cardboard box of personal items in hand. The consulting contract turned out to be more valuable than I'd anticipated. Priya was talented but overwhelmed, and the systems I'd built were more complex than anyone had realized until I was gone. I ended up working approximately 60 hours over the first month, instead of the 20 we'd estimated, but I billed honestly, and the company paid without complaint. By the second month, Priya had grown more confident, and calls for help decreased. By the third month, she was functioning independently, and my consulting engagement concluded naturally. During those 3 months, I'd also been actively pursuing new opportunities. The modified non-compete allowed me to interview with competitors as long as I wasn't actively soliciting current clients. I received multiple offers, ultimately accepting a position as Director of Analytics at a larger company in our industry, with a starting salary of $105,000, a $20,000 increase over my previous compensation. The new position offered better career trajectory, more resources to build sophisticated analytics capabilities, and a leadership role that would accelerate my professional growth. 6 months after leaving my previous company, the non-compete expired completely. I was now free to work with any clients, though I had no interest in actively soliciting the former employer's business. I was too busy building new systems and relationships in my current role. One afternoon, I received a call from Helena, my former HR manager. "I hope it's not awkward for me to reach out," she began. "But I wanted you to know that your negotiation of severance terms ended up changing our entire approach to layoffs." "How so?" I asked, curious. "After you left, we had several other employees in specialized roles ask why they couldn't negotiate terms like you had. Rather than fight those requests case by case, we revised our severance policy to better account for unique situations. We now evaluate each position being eliminated on factors like knowledge retention needs, transition complexity, and non-compete provisions, then calculate severance accordingly, rather than using a simple formula." Helena continued, "It's made layoffs more complicated and more expensive in some cases, but it's also resulted in better outcomes. Smoother transitions, more documentation, less institutional knowledge loss. And employees feel the process is fairer because we're acknowledging individual circumstances rather than applying arbitrary formulas." "That's gratifying to hear," I said honestly. "I'm glad my negotiation led to positive changes. There's another thing," Helena added. "You demonstrated that negotiating based on value and self-interest, without being emotional or vindictive, is possible during a layoff. Several employees who've been let go since you have followed your model. Calm, rational, focused on fair outcomes rather than feelings. It's made my job much less stressful." After we hung up, I reflected on the journey from that moment in the conference room when Bradley announced layoffs to my current position. When they'd expected me to cry, I'd calculated instead. When they'd expected passive acceptance, I'd negotiated. And when they'd expected emotional reaction, I'd focused on rational self-interest and fair compensation. The calculation had paid off. Better severance, consulting income, improved terms, strong reference, and ultimately a better position with significantly higher compensation. But the lessons extended beyond just financial outcomes. I'd learned that loyalty to employers who were eliminating positions was misplaced emotion. I'd learned that negotiating based on value rather than entitlement or anger produced better outcomes. I'd learned that knowing your contract, understanding your leverage, and presenting rational arguments was more effective than tears or threats. A year after the layoffs, I ran into Bradley at an industry conference. He greeted me warmly, asking about my new role, and expressing genuine pleasure at my success. I wanted to apologize for how I handled our initial severance conversation, Bradley said over coffee in the conference center cafe. "I was defensive and dismissive when you tried to negotiate, treating it as threatening rather than recognizing it as reasonable advocacy for your interests." "I appreciate you saying that," I replied. "Though I understood your position, you had a difficult job executing layoffs, and my negotiation complicated what you'd hoped would be a straightforward process." Bradley shook his head. "It shouldn't have been about what was easy for me. It should have been about what was fair for everyone affected. Your negotiation taught me that, and it's changed how I approach similar situations." He paused before continuing. "I'm curious, when we first told you that you were being laid off, what was your immediate reaction? What were you feeling before you started negotiating?" I thought back to that moment in the conference room. Honestly, my first feeling was fear. Fear about income, about health insurance, about finding new employment. But I immediately pushed past that fear to focus on what I could control. Understanding my terms, identifying leverage, and negotiating the best possible outcome. "Most people in that situation just feel the fear," Bradley observed. "They react emotionally, maybe cry, maybe get angry, maybe just accept whatever we offer because they're overwhelmed. You converted fear into strategy almost instantly. How did you do that?" I considered his question carefully. I think it was partly personality. I've always been more analytical than emotional. But it was also deliberate choice. I recognized that showing fear or crying would weaken my negotiating position. If I appeared desperate or broken, you'd have no reason to offer better terms. But if I appeared calm and strategic, if I demonstrated I had options and understood my value, you'd have to take my negotiations seriously. So, the calmness was performance? Bradley asked. Partly, I admitted. I was genuinely scared underneath, but I chose to present strategic confidence rather than emotional vulnerability because that presentation would produce better outcomes. That's remarkably self-aware and disciplined, Bradley said. Most people can't separate their feelings from their reactions that quickly. We talked for another 30 minutes about careers, industry trends, and the challenges of managing layoffs humanely. As we parted, Bradley said something that stayed with me. You know what you really did? You refused to be a victim. You were victimized by a layoff you didn't cause and didn't deserve, but you refused to act like a victim. You acted like a professional with valuable skills negotiating fair compensation. That refusal to accept victimhood was as important as the strategic negotiation. I thought about that observation frequently in the following weeks. Was Bradley right that I'd refused victimhood? Or had I simply been pragmatic, recognizing that emotional reactions wouldn't serve my interests? Perhaps the distinction didn't matter. The result was the same. I'd converted a potentially devastating situation into an opportunity for better outcomes. 18 months after the layoff, I was promoted in my new role to Vice President of Analytics, with a compensation package worth approximately $140,000 annually. I'd become a recognized expert in building data analytics infrastructure, regularly speaking at conferences and publishing articles about best practices. During one conference presentation about strategic career management, I shared the story of my layoff negotiation. I debated whether to discuss it publicly, not wanting to seem like I was gloating about extracting more severance than colleagues. But I decided the lessons were valuable enough to share despite potential criticism. When I was laid off, people expected me to cry. I told the audience of data professionals. My colleagues cried. They pleaded. They accepted whatever severance was offered because they were too overwhelmed to negotiate. But I calculated instead. I reviewed my contract, identified my leverage, and negotiated terms that reflected my actual value and the restrictions they were asking me to accept. I walked through the specifics: the non-compete leverage, the documentation of value provided, the consulting contract proposal, the modified restrictions. The result was approximately $9,500 additional severance plus significantly better terms for my post-employment freedom. But more importantly, the negotiation taught me that I could advocate for myself even in vulnerable situations. The lesson isn't just about severance, I continued. It's about recognizing that you have agency even when you feel powerless. Getting laid off feels like something being done to you, something outside your control. But how you respond is entirely within your control. You can react emotionally, or you can respond strategically. Both are understandable, but only one typically produces better outcomes. The response was enthusiastic. After the presentation, dozens of people approached asking detailed questions about negotiation tactics, sharing their own layoff stories, expressing appreciation for demonstrating that professional self-advocacy during layoffs was both possible and valuable. One woman in her 50s approached with tears in her eyes. I was laid off 6 months ago, she told me. I just accepted whatever they offered because I was so scared and overwhelmed. I didn't know negotiation was possible, didn't think I had any leverage. Hearing your story, I realize I probably left money and better terms on the table by not even trying. Don't second-guess your choices, I told her gently. You did what you thought was right in a difficult moment. What matters is learning from the experience. If you're ever in that situation again, you'll know negotiation is possible, and you'll be better prepared. But her words haunted me. How many people accepted unfavorable severance terms simply because they didn't realize negotiation was possible? How many employers relied on employees being too emotional or intimidated to advocate for themselves? 2 years after my layoff, I started consulting on the side, helping professionals negotiate employment terms, not just severance, but also job offers, raises, promotions, and exit packages. My approach was always the same: understand your contract and company policies, document your unique value, identify leverage points, and present rational arguments based on fair compensation rather than emotional appeals. The consulting practice grew through word-of-mouth referrals. I helped a software engineer negotiate a $40,000 increase to a job offer by documenting his specialized skills and the market rates for similar positions. I helped a marketing director negotiate 6 months bat severance instead of the standard 3 months by identifying transition needs and offering to create extensive documentation. I helped a researcher negotiate removal of a restrictive non-compete by pointing out she'd never agreed to it in writing and it would be difficult to enforce. Each client reinforced the same lessons I'd learned during my own layoff. Most people undervalue themselves. Most people don't realize negotiation is possible in employment situations, and most people weaken their position by reacting emotionally rather than strategically. 3 years after the layoff that had changed my career trajectory, I was sitting in my office when I received an unexpected call from Timothy Walsh, the CEO of my former company, who'd been involved in negotiating my final severance terms. "I hope it's not strange for me to call," Timothy began. "But I wanted to share something with you. Your negotiation 3 years ago fundamentally changed our company culture around layoffs and employment transitions." "Helena mentioned you'd revised your severance policies," I said. "It went beyond just policy revision," Timothy replied. "Your approach taught our leadership team that employment relationships are actually negotiations between parties with different interests. Before your situation, we treated employment as us granting jobs and employees being grateful. You demonstrated that employment is a mutual exchange of value, and when we end that exchange, we should negotiate fairly, based on what each party contributed and what restrictions we're asking them to accept." He continued, "We've since applied that principle more broadly. When we hire people, we negotiate more transparently about compensation and expectations. When we give raises, we base them on documented value rather than arbitrary percentages. When we do layoffs, we treat them as contract terminations requiring negotiation rather than pronouncements from on high. It's made us a better employer, and it's improved retention and morale." "That's remarkable," I said, genuinely moved. "I never imagined my individual negotiation would have that kind of systemic impact." "It did," Timothy confirmed. "And I wanted you to know that, because you could have approached that situation with anger or bitterness. You could have been vindictive or difficult. Instead, you were professional, rational, and focused on fair outcomes. That approach was as important as the specific terms you negotiated." After we hung up, I sat thinking about the journey from that conference room